Welcome to another episode of Odd Hour, where I talk about mysteries, weird stories, and the little known for any amount of time less than an hour. As always, I'm Isaiah Ephraim. We're going aboard another vessel. We are sailing to the Marloes Peninsula, Pembrokeshire, Wales, to a small coastline clustering of rocks. It is an isolated outcropping, 20 miles west of the nearest land. It would be a long voyage to reach in case of emergency. This is the Smalls Lighthouse, the scene of our grotesque story today. This is the story of the two Thomases, the foundation behind Robert Eggers' film The Lighthouse, the Smalls Lighthouse tragedy. The Smalls Lighthouse was not the first lighthouse on this outcropping peninsula. The original lighthouse was constructed in 1775 by instrument maker Henry Whiteside. The 1775 lighthouse was built with 9 pillars that raised it above sea level to allow water to pass underneath. For its first 80 years of life, it stood as it was initially, though more and more pillars were added for extra stability. It went under new designs and rebuilt in 1777, after a storm damaged the island and lighthouse. Its design was intriguing, and very different from the traditional style of European lighthouses. Most do not have this pillar structure, but rather the swirling upward bricking aesthetic. It was this lighthouse that our Thomases found themselves. The lighthouse entered its 26th year in 1801, and 2 keepers had come to be stationed at the Smalls. They were Thomas Griffith and Thomas Howell, similar only in name. The lighthouse, according to regulations, needed only 2 workers to be dispatched to the island to maintain the lantern. Howell was the elder of the 2, only at middle age, but Griffith was a towering fellow. Among the community that they came from, Solva, Pembrokeshire, it was common knowledge that Howell and Griffith disliked each other. In a quote from the book Rock Lighthouses of Britain, the 2 men's attitude towards the other is illustrated. Quote, "There was nothing they had not disagreed about. They could empty bars of public houses with the force of their arguments, especially when it looked as though they were coming to blows over something. They never did." Unquote. Despite their disagreements, the 2 were experienced keepers, and Howell was also talented at woodworking, and is often referred to as a copper. Once they were on the island, it would only be the 2 of them for company. They arrived at the Smalls in the winter, a winter that was particularly ferocious. Initially a 4-week venture, bad inclement weather forced the 2 to be marooned on the island for nearly 4 months. It would be enough to drive any stable-minded man insane. Quote, "For 4 months, it was found impossible to land the rock. Many attempts were made, but all to no success. A storm had set in." Unquote. Nevertheless, the lantern had to be maintained, a task that was now especially pertinent if they were to leave the island on a rescue ship. Several days into their time on the Smalls, Griffith began to complain of feeling ill. Despite their animosity, Howell attempted to heal the younger man. It was only the 2 of them on the island. What else was there to do? Whiteside, in a report of the tragedy after, stated, quote, "The means employed by his companion of affording relief proved ineffectual." Unquote. A week on the island, Howell displayed a signal of distress. Griffith was ill, and he would not be able to maintain the lantern and look after his colleagues simultaneously. The sign of distress would remain hoisted on the lighthouse until the eventual rescue. It could be seen from land. 20 miles is quite far, but ships on the Irish Sea would be able to spot it on the flat water. However, the storm and weather continued to rage, forcing any vessels that attempted to breach the island to retreat for safety. Quote, "Night after night, saw some of them on the cliffs, watching the lights, fearful of something having befallen the both of them. The non-appearance of a light would have been direct proof that such was the case, but as regularly as they watched, the light burned with its usual brightness, and gave no indication of the suffering of the poor, sick, and imprisoned lightkeepers." Unquote. Griffith, while attending to the light in the lantern room, exhausted from his prolonged illness, collapsed, quote, striking his head on a metal stanchion as he fell, unquote. When Howell discovered the scene, there was nothing that could be done to save his fellow keeper. Griffith had died. Fear began to spike in the remaining keeper, Howell. Their antagonism towards each other was well known and documented back home in Wales. He knew that Griffith needed to be disposed of before decomposition set in, but if Howell were to throw the body into the sea, he would almost certainly be accused of murdering him himself. He was caught between a rock and a slowly decaying corpse. Quote, almost out of his mind with fear, Howell managed to raise the flag of distress once more and make appropriate entries in the log about his companion's death. All he could do now was to wait for his long overdue relief and pray to God that it would not be long in coming, unquote. This relief from the Smalls would still be several weeks away, for the storm around the island continued to grow in intensity, causing high waves to break against the lighthouse and cause the house to creak sickeningly. Howell was now in the company of a corpse that was gradually decaying in front of him. In the small house within, the stench of death was dreadful and pervading. Quote, after all, this was not a large structure. The hut was less than 5 meters, or 16 feet in diameter, so any attempts to escape the reality would have been futile ones, unquote. Howell knew something must be done about the corpse if he too were to survive the Smalls. Utilizing his skills with the woodworking, Howell fashioned a makeshift coffin out of cabinets in the dwelling area, to which Griffith's body was placed within. Quote, after a great deal of labor, the body was carried to the platform and firmly secured to the railing, unquote. This area was just outside the windows of the dwelling apartment. This allowed the coffin to remain outside the lighthouse for Howell to remain inside, whilst the corpse instead decayed outside. Howell continued to maintain the lantern in the days after his companion's death, each night watching the raging storm outside the apartment's window. But the storm did not subside, instead increased in magnitude. The waves continued to smash against the pillars of the lighthouse, and still each night, Howell watched the raging storm. And then one night, a major breaker smashed against the side of the dwelling apartment, and in an appalling crack, the makeshift coffin split apart, and Griffith's decomposing body tumbled outward, where it was caught in the railings. With one arm free, the body's arm waved in the wind, visible from the apartment window for Howell to witness every hour of his solitude. In the wind, Griffith's free arm seemed to beckon at the lone keeper, calling him into the surf and tempest where he too would join Griffith in eternity. Day after day after day after day, Howell manned the lantern and witnessed the immense horror of his companion's decaying body. Decomposition would be quick in this environment. No doubt, Howell witnessed every stage of grotesqueness accompanied with the process. Maggots forming, eyes leaching forward, skin bloating in the salty air. And every night, Griffith continued to beckon him outward, as though whispering, "This too could be your fate." Howell remained on the island for 3 weeks with the rotting carcass of Griffith. Boats still tried to make their way to the Smalls, and quote, on one occasion a vessel managed to battle near enough to the ricks to notice a man leaning motionless on the gallery next to a flag of distress, his hand waving freely as if trying to attract attention. Upon reporting their findings, some concern was felt for the keepers. Yet every night, punctual as ever, the beacon of the lighthouse could be seen from the land. What then could be the matter on the Smalls? Unquote. Slowly, very slowly, the storm around the island began to break, and taking the chance to get to the island, a boat raced the 20 miles to the isolated peninsula. It was only then that the reality of the situation was learned. Quote, in a state of complete exhaustion, near hysteria and absolute fatigue, the solitary keeper had never failed in his duty, tending the lantern for day after miserable day, with only the putrefying remains of his colleague for company, unquote. In the 4 months he had spent isolated on the Smalls, Howell had changed to a drastic extent. to the point where even close friends did not recognize him upon his return. It is said his hair had grayed, some saying it had gone white completely. His face sported more wrinkles, and not just because of the sea air, and his paranormal anxiety never dwindled. As the rescuers examined the island and retrieved Griffith's body from where it had broken out of the wooden coffin, a full reality of the situation Howell had endured came into view. Quote, "As the event became known, it was obvious that what the earlier rescue bid had seen was the free hand of the corpse being blown by the wind in a morbid greeting, enticing them to come nearer." Unquote. In the aftermath of the tragedy that occurred on the Smalls, maritime regulations swiftly changed, as Whiteside mandated that there was to be 3 keepers in the lighthouses rather than 2, quote, "so that if one keeper should fall ill, the light could be maintained by the other 2 without undue suffering, and so prevent a repetition of the Smalls tragedy." Unquote. Thomas Howell was saved, his life irreversibly changed, his previous self unrecognizable to himself and his friends. And Thomas Griffith was put to rest after 4 months of unrest, the Smalls lighthouse remaining a monument of horrific tragedy and a beacon of safety and guidance. The tale of the 2 Thomases is easily one of the most grotesque stories out there, and until 2019, it was a story that only local Welsh fully knew of. However, Robert and Max Eggers drew heavily upon the manic and outlandish aspects of the story and further horrified them, so to speak, in The Lighthouse. The similarities are easy to see. 2 Thomases, one older and one younger, who are constantly at each other's throats and exhibit the erratic behavior as being possessed by the sea, stuck on an isolated island for longer than was expected, the 2 giving way to the paranoia and insanity of the mind until they lose themselves in the beam of the lantern light. In fact, quote, "The Lighthouse is an amalgamation of a myriad of ideas. The script started off as an adaptation of an unfinished Edgar Allan Poe story, similarly called The Lighthouse," unquote. Eldritch themes of a deep-seated presence that has always been here, will always be here, and does not care about you, is an encompassing feeling pervading the film, and it was never uncommon for lighthouse keepers to die or go missing on the job, or report the sightings of creatures far out of their scope of understanding. When watching The Lighthouse, it is almost as though Cthulhu is just beneath the pillars, but does not yet deem humanity important enough to emerge from the deeps. 1980 saw the automation of lighthouses on a global level, and the need for 1, 2, or 3 permanent lighthouse keepers was now a defunct and unnecessary profession. Smalls Lighthouse remains as it was in the 1800s on the coastline of Pembrokeshire, Wales. The tragedy and ghosts of the past, not so long forgotten. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Odd Hour. The Lighthouse was one of the last films I was able to see in theaters before quarantine with my best friend, and I was absolutely floored by the imagery and the mythology created in an hour and a half. I loved it so much that I adopted the name Ephraim as my middle name, and I cosplayed as Winslow and Thomas. It is honestly one of my favorite films. I cannot recommend it enough. I had never known about the true story that lay at the basis of the screenplay until a post had showed up on Tumblr that told the story. The poster is Welsh, and the story gets passed along by word of mouth, generation to generation. And I was super intrigued and surprised that I had never heard of the Smalls Lighthouse tragedy before, and I really wanted to share it with you all. As always, you can find all sources for this episode in the description, along with an episode transcript. If you know of any stories you want to hear an episode for, email me at irdwriting@gmail.com and let me know. Intro music for this episode is Mysterious Strange Things by Young Logos. Narration music by Patrick Patricos. Check them out on YouTube. They're really good. Follow me at HeyNancyBoy on Twitter and at OOPierre on Tumblr. You can also find me on YouTube at Isaiah Ephraim, which will also be linked in the description. My Patreon has been updated for 2021. Some of it was behind, so I made sure everything is up to speed. You can also listen to the podcast a day early if you pledge at the $3 tier. I don't want to put any ads on these episodes at all because I find them absolutely annoying, but it does take a lot of time to research and produce this podcast, especially since I'm all by myself. And I just want to tell stories for as long as possible. I've been your host, Isaiah Ephraim. Stay weird, and join me again soon for more mysteries, weird stories, and all things little known.